So our second speaker actually sent his presentation in ahead of time. Jonathan. Eric Hunley, everyone, give it up to Eric Hunley, who runs the Unstructured podcast. And if you haven't seen it, he's not wearing his shirt. But he's wearing somebody else's shirt. Whose shirt did you steal?
I'm mugged somebody.
He runs the Unstructured podcast, which has incredible artwork and incredible conversations. I've been on it twice. Some other people in this room have been on it as well. And I am going to pass it off to you, Eric.
All right, thanks for the intro, Joe. Eric Hunley, Unstructured, as on the screen. Today's topic is guest research. I'm not the brightest guy on the planet. I get bored easily, and I like to interview an extremely wide variety of guests. I've had everyone from the runner-up libertarian presidential candidate to a musher. So I'd like to think I have range. Is everybody hearing me all right? Yes. Okay, cool. Now, in order to talk to all the different people, I need to find ways to research them. And in order to keep the show interesting, hopefully I can find information about them that isn't necessarily well known in the public or will surprise them or delight them. And then they'll calm down. I don't know if you guys have listened to a lot of interview podcasts. Do you guys like stock questions?
No.
No? Okay, well, I personally despise them, but that is one method you could technically build a bunch of stock questions. What I like to do is build a set of questions for a particular guest, and while I'm interviewing, I'll go to the question if I have nothing. I hope the question opens up a line of conversation. If it does, awesome. Then I can dump the questions. And that's part of the magic, I think, of an interview podcast, is if you can keep it on the fly. Now, there's different places to find good information. Some of these are screamingly obvious. Google. You probably can find things about people there. Another good place to go is previous interviews. So Apple Podcasts, I'm always going to search that. And lately Podchaser has come into the market. I will look there, but it's not completely fleshed out yet. So definitely search around in both. Google for previous episodes, and then YouTube. YouTube, I'll sometimes forget about, but often people will be on an obscure video or they just happen to appear on something, and a lot of times it's several years old, and I find some of the best information comes from there because they'll forget about it. And then you'll go ask them about it, and they're like, how'd you know that? Did you read my mind? Are you stalking? So when I'm listening to previous interviews, I'm always listening to, did they say something that isn't covered? Because we've all heard that, right? We're going through questions, and the guest is answering, and the host asks something, and then the guest will say something like, yeah, ever since my daughter died, I never go to the pool anymore. Oh yeah, so how is your business going for you? And you're going, what? Wait, why didn't you cover that? Well, this is an example. Gentleman here is James Fallon. James Fallon is most famous because he studies brain scans, famously of psychopaths. And while he was studying brain scans of psychopaths, it turns out that his brain scan got mixed up and, he's a psychopath. So he's a very interesting guest. He's been all over the place. But in a previous interview, he talked about how George Carlin was a family friend. And they blew by. So during the interview, I asked, hey, how about George Carlin? Found out that he was an adopted family member of the Carlins, and that George Carlin would have him in the audience behind people kind of researching and determining if his material is working or not. So James Fallon was spying for George Carlin in the audience. This is really interesting material. He lit up, was having a great time, and he also kept talking about how George Carlin thought he was going crazy. And he'd call up and he'd say, Jimmy, am I going nuts? And just in the Carlin tone, which I can never actually imitate. And that made for an interesting conversation. This leads to another. Look for the unexplored. This is Mandy O'Brien. Mandy O'Brien does body language. She reads videos, watches them. Now she has a bit of a, shall we say, right-leaning, very conservative, kind of controversial. But I do like a controversial guest. That does get a lot of feedback. It can be interesting. Well, she happened to cover James Fallon. So another thing I like to do is go to previous guests and bring them into the conversation, mention what they've done. Well, she covered him, and her determination is that he was full of it about the brain scans, but he was a psychopath because he took joy out of playing with people. So it's kind of an interesting twist. It's like, we're not certain if he's a psychopath, but he's a psychopath because the way he's reacting about psychopathic things. Either way, interesting conversation. Another place to look is dig on their sites. Dig anywhere you can. This is Jim Clemente. You guys might have heard a show, Criminal Minds. He came from the FBI. He was part of the Behavioral Analysis Unit and is a writer, producer on Criminal Minds. While I was prepping for a show, I just started digging through his site, found a PDF that was a few years old, and it talked about him having, quote, bone cancer after 9/11. And I'd never seen it anywhere else. So I asked him about it, and that broke into a whole conversation about his being a first responder at 9/11, getting leukemia, dying on the table multiple times, having a heart attack, and apparently one of his peers had been buried a week before we had the interview. So it's really just a powerful, powerful interview. I also like to dig into other obscure references. This is Rick Allen Ross. He's a cult expert. Turns out that there are people who aren't always a fan of him. And there was a bulletin board with somebody complaining about him, but saying he liked to beat up on another cult expert, Steve Hassan. So I took advantage of it and I asked him, what do you think of Steve Hassan? And he, of course, had to dig at him during the interview. Other options are, if your guests have material and something that they promote or do, in this case, this is Perry Marshall, and he has a test called the Marketing DNA Test. Now, he's been on hundreds and hundreds of interviews, and I decided, well, let me take his test. Then we could talk about what my results were on his test, and he loved it. Out of all his interviews, no one had ever bothered taking his test and visiting what the subject is. And he, of course, lit up. So it makes for a more interesting interview, and he's expressing his subject matter, and we're demonstrating a product. Last, ask your audience for help. I am not a lawyer, but I know of a lot of legal-minded people, so I ask them for questions ahead of time. The other guy there, that's Austin Peterson, runner-up presidential libertarian candidate. I have a group, and they tend to be all over the spectrum, some very left, some very right, all very controversial, and so they were going to give me hard questions, and I got to ask them some very hard-hitting questions. And I lied. One more. Enlist previous guests. If I don't know what I'm doing, maybe I've had a guest on before who can come on and be a co-host and ask good questions. So behind me you'll see there's Marco Perazzo, who is an MMA coach. And I had Larry Roberts. Larry Roberts is a martial artist. And he asked the questions that got me to know that Marco Perazzo not only was an MMA coach, but he was going to be at the corner at the next UFC, which is happening that coming weekend. I never would have known that. I got it. The last one, I was dealing with a psychic type body whisperer or whatever, which is so far out of my depth that I recruited a couple guests to speak with her as well, one of which is, he's in the room. And through that, I was able to have a balanced conversation because I'm extremely cynical towards the subject, so I brought in other people to soften the blow. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Eric. Next, we'll have Terry. Carried.